This is my true story. I was a father who gave everything to my only son. I worked days and nights so he could live in comfort. I built the house they live in. But one evening, his wife told him to kick me out like a stray dog. My son laughed and pushed me to the door while I stood there, humiliated in my own home. They closed the door and left me standing in the cold. That laugh cut deeper than any knife. But I made one phone call that ruined their life forever. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe to me. I worked all my life for that family. Every breath I took had their names on it. From the moment I woke up till the moment I slept, my only thought was how to make their lives better. I started with nothing, not even a proper roof. I built that house with my own hands, one brick after another, under the sun that burned and the rain that never stopped. My fingers cracked, my back bent, but I smiled through it. I thought love and effort would be enough to buy peace in old age. I fixed cars in the day and cleaned workshops at night. I came home with grease on my hands and pain in my bones, but I never complained. My son was young then. He'd wait at the window, wave at me, and run into my arms when I came home. That little smile was my world. I believed he would remember those days. I believed all my sacrifices would come back as warmth when I grew old. I gave him everything I never had: new shoes when I walked barefoot, books when I grew up with none, food when I had gone hungry. I stayed hungry many nights so he could eat meat. I gave him my coat when the winter was cruel. I fixed his first bike, paid his college fees, sold my old land for his wedding. I thought I was giving him a better life, but I was only digging my own grave of trust. His wife came later, polite at first, soft words, fake smiles. She called me father only when others were watching. Behind doors, her eyes rolled like I was dirt on the floor. But I stayed quiet. I told myself, that's just how young people are now. I didn't want to disturb my son's peace. I worked even harder to pay off their loans, to keep the house running smooth. Every month, I sent part of my pension into that house. I fixed broken pipes, replaced lights, trimmed the garden. I made sure everything looked fine because I wanted them to live in comfort. When they needed money for a car, I gave it. When they wanted to renovate, I sold my gold ring. When they dreamed of a vacation, I stayed behind to water the plants. I gave and gave and gave. I didn't keep count, because a father doesn't count when he loves. I believed he'd never forget who carried him when he was weak. I believed he'd never forget who stayed awake at night when he had fever. I thought blood would protect me. But years changed him. His face stayed the same, but his voice turned colder, shorter, more distant. He started calling me old man instead of father. I heard whispers between them at night, about money, about the house, about getting rid of me. I ignored it. I told myself it was stress, it would pass. But kindness is dangerous when it meets greed. My son stopped asking if I'd eaten. His wife stopped pretending to care. I started feeling like a guest in the home I built. My shoes had no place at the door. My cup had no space on the shelf. I'd wake early and sit quietly in the corner, listening to them talk, laughing about things I no longer understood. Sometimes they'd leave without saying goodbye. Sometimes they'd return late, pretend not to see me, and shut their door. I told myself it's okay. They're busy. They have their own life. But deep down, I could feel something dying. Not in my body, but in my heart. I had become invisible in my own home. I ate alone, slept alone, and walked past my own son like a stranger. Yet still, I prayed for him every night. I prayed that life would teach him patience, that he'd never know hunger like I did. I had no idea that soon he'd show me a cruelty even hunger could never match. I had no idea the son I raised with love would one day stand beside the woman who told him to kick me out. That night started like any other, but ended like no night before. I had cooked a small meal for myself, plain rice and lentils, nothing fancy. The light in the living room was dim, and their laughter echoed from the next room. I heard the sound of glasses clinking, the smell of food that wasn't meant for me. My son and his wife were having friends over. I didn't mind. I never did. I only wanted peace. I was sitting quietly in my chair near the window, when I heard her voice cut through the noise, sharp, cruel, and full of disgust. She said, "Kick this old man out." Just like that, not in anger, not in frustration, but with a grin, as if I was a bad joke in her perfect night. The words froze the room. I waited for my son to speak up, to defend me, to remind her that this was my house. But he didn't. He laughed. He laughed like he agreed. My heart dropped inside my chest like a stone in cold water. He stood up, swaying a little from the drinks, and said nothing. That silence was louder than any insult. His wife smirked. I looked at him, the same boy whose fever I once cooled with wet cloths, the boy I carried on my shoulders when he was tired. I searched his face for a sign of shame, of hesitation. There was none, only that laugh. He walked toward me, slowly, like I was an object to be moved. I stood up before he could reach me. My legs shook, not from fear, but from disbelief. I said nothing. I didn't have to. My eyes told him everything, the pain, the disappointment, the loss that words couldn't carry. His wife rolled her eyes, pointed to the door, and said again, "Go on, kick him out." He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. I felt it hit my face like truth. I stepped outside without a word. Behind me, I heard the door slam. The laughter started again, muffled now, but still there. I stood in the yard, holding my small blanket, staring at the lights in the window. The lights I paid for, the walls I painted, the roof I built. I waited, thinking maybe he'd open the door and tell me it was a joke. But minutes passed. Nothing. Only silence and wind. I sat down on the porch, too proud to beg, too hurt to leave. My hands trembled. I felt old for the first time in my life. The street was empty, the night quiet. A dog barked somewhere far off. I stared at the stars, wondering how the same sky could watch a son laugh while his father froze outside. I stayed there till dawn, shivering, thinking of all the years I gave, all the meals I skipped, all the nights I worked. My body ached, but my heart hurt more. I realized that night that love without respect is slavery. I had lived my whole life believing blood means loyalty. But that night, I learned blood can turn cold faster than snow. The woman inside had more power in one cruel word than I had in decades of sacrifice. The man I raised had become a stranger in my own house. When the morning came, I picked up my blanket, dusted off the dirt, and walked down the road. My legs were weak, but my mind was awake. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. That was the night I stopped being a father and became a man with nothing left to lose. That was the night their laughter turned my silence into a weapon. The next morning, I walked back to that same street with my old coat and my slow steps. I did not go to beg. I only went to collect my tools that I had left in the shed. The street that once greeted me with respect now looked different. Curtains moved, people stared, whispers began. No one needed to ask what happened. News travels fast when it's shameful. Someone must have seen me sitting outside all night, shivering like a beggar near my own door. By sunrise, the whole neighborhood knew. The old man had been kicked out by his son. That became the morning gossip, the evening joke, the story for every teacup on that street. I could feel the words cutting my back as I walked. "He must have done something bad," one said. "No, his son's wife couldn't stand him," another replied. Every voice was a hammer. Every whisper felt like dust thrown at my face. I kept walking, head down, pretending not to hear, but my ears caught everything. The same neighbors who once borrowed my tools now crossed the road when they saw me. The man who used to ask me to fix his fence turned away like he didn't know me. Respect dies fast when humiliation arrives. I reached the corner shop to buy bread, but even the shopkeeper's eyes looked heavy with pity. He didn't ask questions, but I saw the truth written across his face. I paid with trembling hands and left. The sound of coins falling on the counter was louder than my breath. I sat on the bench outside and ate the bread slowly, not because I was hungry, but because it was all I could do to stay calm. Every bite tasted bitter, mixed with shame. I looked across the street and saw my son's window open. His wife stood there watering plants, the same plants I had bought from the nursery years ago. She looked down once, saw me, and smiled. Not the kind of smile that greets, but the kind that mocks. That smile burned inside me more than the cold had. I got up and walked away. People were still talking, still laughing. Some even made stories, saying I was thrown out for being difficult. No one knew the truth, and I didn't try to explain. There's no defense that sounds noble once a man is seen on the street with his blanket. I walked for hours. I didn't even know where I was going. I just kept walking to escape the eyes, the whispers, the laughter. Every step made me older. Every corner I turned carried the echo of betrayal. When I reached the park, I sat under a tree and stared at nothing. Children played nearby, their laughter pure and innocent. It reminded me of when my son was that age. Back then, he laughed with me, not at me. Back then, I was his hero. Somewhere between those years and that night, I had lost him to pride, greed, and a woman's poison. I spent that whole day sitting on that bench, letting the world move while I sat still. By afternoon, even strangers began to recognize me. The old man whose son kicked him out. I had become a story they told their friends. The label stuck like dirt that wouldn't wash off. Shame is heavy when it comes from others, but it crushes differently when it comes from your own blood. As the sun set, I walked again, slower this time. My legs ached, my heart heavier than my steps. I could hear my name being used like a warning. Fathers telling their sons not to end up like me. Sons laughing, saying they never would. I went to the edge of town, to an old bench near the water, and sat down. The wind was strong. I closed my eyes and let it hit my face. It felt like the world was cleaning me of everything soft and weak. By the time night came again, I was no longer the same man. Shame had burned away every piece of me that still hoped for kindness. I promised myself that night, as I watched the streetlights glow far away, that they would one day feel what I felt. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with silence, the kind that destroys more than noise ever could. When I came back to the small room I rented that night, the silence felt heavier than any noise I had ever known. It was a silence that pressed against the walls, that sat beside me, that listened when I breathed. The air was cold, and the single bulb above my head flickered weakly. I sat on the edge of the bed, my blanket folded neatly beside me. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the floor, thinking about all the years that led me to this. The house I built, the son I raised, the love I gave. I remembered each moment like pages in a worn book. I remembered the first day I brought him home from the hospital, a small bundle wrapped in white, crying softly. I remembered how his tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I remembered how I promised I would never let life hurt him the way it hurt me. I remembered the birthdays I worked extra hours to afford. The shoes, the cakes, the school bags. I remembered when he broke his leg, and I carried him to the doctor on my back through the rain because the bus didn't come. I remembered when he got his first job and brought me sweets, smiling like a child again. I remembered the day he married, how proud I was, how I gave him the gold chain that was the last thing his mother left behind. I remembered how I smiled through tears, telling myself he would have a better life than me. But somewhere, between those happy days and that cruel night, something had changed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the wife who whispered poison. Maybe it was time. Or maybe love just fades when comfort replaces gratitude. I don't know. But sitting there that night, I realized I had been blind. I thought family meant safety. I thought my love was enough to protect me. I never imagined that the same people I gave everything to would one day treat me like garbage. My eyes moved to the drawer in the small wooden table beside the bed. I opened it slowly and saw the old papers I had carried for years. Property documents, receipts, small notes. My hands shook as I went through them. I saw proof of every sacrifice I had made. The land deed with my name on it. The receipts for the car payments I made for my son. The loan papers with my signature. The bank slips that showed how I helped him start his business. Everything was there, forgotten by them, remembered by me. I held those papers like a man holding his heartbeat. I had kept them safe all these years, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. That night, they became something else, a reminder that I still had something left: power, proof, truth. My chest rose slowly. For the first time since that night, I stopped feeling small. Those papers were not just pieces of ink and paper. They were my story, written in money, sweat, and blood. I spread them out on the bed and looked at each one carefully. I could almost hear the sound of my hammer hitting nails again, see my hands painting the walls, smell the sawdust of the home I built. I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in calm, that everything I gave was recorded here. They could laugh at me, they could shame me, but they could not erase what I had built. I stacked the papers neatly, tied them with a string, and placed them back in the drawer. I sat still, staring at that drawer for a long time. The wind outside whistled against the window, and the old bulb flickered again. My chest felt lighter now, not because I forgave them, but because I finally remembered who I was. I was not just a broken father. I was a man who had built everything from nothing. I had proof of it all. I lay down slowly, closed my eyes, and said to myself, "They may have thrown me out of my house, but they had no idea I still held the foundation beneath their feet." When the morning came, I woke up before the sun. The room was still dark, but my mind was clear like ice. I sat up on the bed and looked at the small drawer beside me, the one holding those papers. I didn't feel pain anymore. I didn't feel anger either. What I felt was colder, quieter, stronger. It was the kind of feeling that doesn't make noise because it already knows what it's going to do. I folded my blanket, washed my face in the cracked sink, and looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't broken anymore. His eyes were tired, yes, but steady. His face had lines, but those lines told stories of work, patience, and survival. I dried my hands and sat back down. I thought of my son and his wife, still sleeping in the house I built, still believing I would disappear quietly. I imagined them waking up to the same comfort I had created for them, and I felt something twist inside me. Not hate, not revenge, just truth. They had forgotten that every brick in that home had my name on it. Every light that flickered on was paid by my years of labor. They thought they owned me because I was old. They thought age meant weakness. But they forgot that age also means knowledge. I knew things they didn't. I had proof they ignored. I had patience they couldn't match. So I sat there, calm and still, and made my decision. I would not fight them with shouting or begging. I would not lower myself to their level. I would use silence and the law. The same system that had once ignored me, now would work for me. I pulled the drawer open again and spread out all the papers on the bed. I looked at each one carefully, reading every date, every signature. The land deed still had my name as the primary owner. The house registration was never updated after the renovation, something they never noticed. The car payments were made from my account, not his. The business loan they took was still guaranteed under my name. They had built their lives on my shoulders and never checked where their foundation truly rested. My fingers moved slowly across each page. I smiled for the first time in days, not with joy, but with calm certainty. They thought they had thrown me away. They didn't know I still held everything that made them who they were. I folded the papers neatly and placed them inside an old brown folder. I wrote one thing on the cover: proof. Then I put on my coat, buttoned it slowly, and sat for one more minute. I wasn't rushing. I wanted every movement to be clear in my mind. I didn't need to scream for justice. I just needed to make one quiet move. I remembered an old friend from my working days, a man who had once helped me settle a property dispute. He wasn't just a friend, he was someone who understood the law well. We hadn't spoken in years, but I still had his number written on a piece of paper tucked in my wallet. I took out the wallet, unfolded that paper, and stared at the faded ink. That was my path now. I didn't plan revenge. I planned peace through consequence. I put the folder inside my old leather bag, wore my shoes, and stepped outside. The air was cool and clean. The street was quiet. I walked slow, each step steady, like I was walking toward something that had waited for me all along. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a man who had been reborn through betrayal. I passed by the bakery, the park, the corner shop, all the places where whispers had once followed me. I didn't care now. Let them talk. Soon, they would talk about something else, the truth. I reached the small office building at the end of the road, the one with the blue sign that said Law Associates. I stood outside for a moment, took a deep breath, and smiled faintly. The time for pain was over. The time for silence had begun. I stood outside that small office for a long moment before I walked in. The old wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of papers, dust, and ink filled the air. The smell of decisions, of power written in quiet words. The secretary looked up, surprised to see a man like me at that hour. I asked if Mr. Verma still worked there, my old friend from decades ago. She nodded, called his name, and moments later he appeared from the back room, older now, gray around the edges like me, but his eyes still sharp. He recognized me instantly. We shook hands, and he asked me to sit. I told him everything, not with tears or anger, but with plain, simple words. He listened without interrupting once. When I was done, I handed him the folder I had brought. He untied the string and went through each document carefully, page by page. The room was silent except for the soft sound of papers turning. After a long while, he looked up, leaned back, and said quietly, "You've been holding the key all along." He told me exactly what could be done. The steps, the papers, the calls. Everything could be changed with one signature, one formal complaint, and one phone call to the property registrar. He said the house still legally belonged to me, the car too, and even the business loan they had built their comfort on could be recalled under my authority. Every comfort they had came from my name, and my name was still written everywhere that mattered. I didn't smile. I only nodded. He gave me the number of a contact who could handle the filings quickly. He said, "You don't have to fight. Just make the call." That sentence stayed with me. Just make the call. I walked back to my room, the folder lighter now because the weight had shifted from my shoulders to theirs. I sat by the window, took out my old phone, and stared at it for a while. The number he gave me was written on a small yellow slip of paper. My hand didn't shake when I dialed it. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. I explained who I was, what I had, and what I wanted to do. No emotion, just facts. He asked for copies of the documents. I said they were already being processed by Mr. Verma's office. He paused, then said, "Understood, sir. We'll begin the transfer immediately." That was it. No shouting, no noise, just a simple call that set everything in motion. When I hung up, the room felt different, lighter, quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, not peace, but clarity. I made tea, sat on my chair, and looked out the window. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars honking, people walking, the same streetlights blinking. But inside me, something powerful had changed. I had always believed revenge came from anger, but that day I learned it comes from patience. It comes from knowing exactly when to move. As the hours passed, messages started to move between offices. Files began to shift from one desk to another. Paperwork that had been ignored for years suddenly became active again. By evening, my phone buzzed with a confirmation. The house and assets were legally in my name again. My son didn't know yet. His wife didn't know either. They were probably sitting in my living room, drinking tea, still laughing, thinking the old man was gone for good. They had no idea the floor beneath them already belonged to me again. I sat still, breathing slow, letting the truth settle. One phone call had undone everything they built on lies. I didn't smile, but a small breath escaped my chest. Not joy, not triumph, just release. I looked at the old bulb above me and whispered, "It's done." That night, I slept for the first time in days. Deep, calm, dreamless sleep. Because I knew when the morning came, their laughter would finally stop. The next morning, I woke up before dawn again. The sky outside was still dark, painted with faint blue streaks that slowly turned pale. The world was quiet, only the sound of distant dogs barking and the rustle of leaves outside the window. I sat on the edge of my bed, calm, breathing slow. The phone call had been made. The papers were moving. There was nothing more I needed to do now. My part was done. The rest would unfold on its own. I poured myself a cup of tea, the same old chipped mug I'd used for years, and held it between my hands as the steam rose gently. I looked out the window, at the narrow street where the first light was beginning to fall. It was strange. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the heavy weight on my chest. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt still, waiting. True revenge, I realized, isn't about fire or shouting. It's about silence, the kind that creeps in slowly, that makes the other person wonder what's coming. I sat in that silence for hours. The clock ticked, the tea turned cold, and I didn't move. My hands were steady, my eyes sharp. Somewhere, far away, I knew papers were being signed, calls were being made, files were being stamped. I didn't have to see it. I could feel it, like the sound of a storm still hidden behind clouds. Every system moves slow, but when truth sits inside it, it doesn't stop. I imagined my son and his wife that morning, waking up, stretching, living their day without a clue. She probably cooked breakfast, maybe bragged about how quiet the house felt without me there. He probably agreed, sipping his tea like a king in his castle. But the castle was already built on sand. I waited. Hours passed. I took slow walks outside, just around the block. The same neighbors who once whispered now didn't know how to look at me. Some nodded awkwardly. Some avoided my eyes. It didn't matter anymore. I had no words for anyone. I came back, sat by the window again, and opened the small radio I kept. Old songs played, songs I used to hum while building that house brick by brick. The music didn't make me cry this time. It made me remember. Every sound of hammer and nail echoed in those tunes. Every sigh, every sweat drop. That house wasn't theirs. It was mine. My work, my hands, my soul. And now, on paper, it was mine again too. I took another sip of tea, now cold but comforting. Waiting has a rhythm. It teaches you to breathe slow, to let patience do the talking. I had learned that the hard way. I looked down at my phone several times that day, not because I expected a message, but because I knew eventually it would come. Something always breaks when truth begins to surface. Evening came, and I sat on the same chair, the light from the window turning orange. Outside, the neighborhood carried on. Kids running, women hanging clothes, men arguing about small things. Life moves, even when the biggest storms are about to hit. Around sunset, the phone finally rang. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just a soft vibration that broke the silence. I answered. It was Mr. Verma's office. The voice on the other end said everything was finalized. All transfers complete. All notifications issued. I thanked him quietly. He said, "They'll find out soon." I ended the call and set the phone down. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just sat still, letting the air settle around me. It felt like the calm before thunder. I made another cup of tea and watched the sky darken. The streetlights came on one by one. Somewhere far away, a door would soon be knocked on. Somewhere, papers would be handed over. Somewhere, my name would echo again, not as shame this time, but as ownership. I waited for that sound. I didn't need to be there. Sometimes justice doesn't need eyes. It only needs silence and time. It happened the very next morning. I was sitting by my window again, tea in hand, when the quiet of the street broke. 3 black cars stopped outside my old house. The house I built, the one they had laughed in. Men in uniform stepped out, holding files and official envelopes. I didn't move. I just watched. They knocked on the door, firm and heavy. From where I sat, I could almost hear the confusion inside. Curtains moved, shadows shifted, and then the door opened. My son stood there in his nightclothes, half awake, face blank. Behind him, his wife appeared, still in her robe, eyes sharp but nervous. The men spoke calmly, their tone polite but cold. They handed him a thick file, and I could see the bold stamp even from my distance. Notice of repossession. My name was printed clearly on the cover. He took the papers with shaking hands. She snatched them from him and began flipping through the pages, her face draining of color with every word she read. I could almost see the exact moment it hit her, when she realized everything inside that house no longer belonged to them. The roof over their heads, the car in the driveway, even the business they bragged about. All gone. All mine again. She shouted something at the officers, pointing and pacing, her voice growing louder, shriller. But the men didn't flinch. They were only doing their job. They told her the documents were final and that they had 72 hours to vacate the property. My son tried to argue, his hands waving helplessly, but his words fell flat. One of the men showed him the signature on the papers. Mine. I didn't hear what was said next, but I saw what followed. The laughter that once filled those walls was gone. The pride vanished from their faces. My son stood still, pale, like the blood had left him. His wife sank into a chair near the doorway, her hands clutching her head. The same woman who told him to kick this old man out now sat speechless, the walls closing in on her. I watched from my window in silence. There was no joy in me, only quiet justice. Neighbors began to gather, whispering, watching the scene unfold. The same mouths that once called me a fool now stared in disbelief. Some even smiled faintly, not at me, but at the truth finally being served. I didn't wave. I didn't move. I just sipped my tea and let the moment breathe. The sound of their voices carried faintly down the street. Anger, panic, disbelief. My son's tone cracked between pleading and shouting. The officers stayed calm. One of them pointed to the car, another to the house papers. I could tell they were explaining everything, how the documents proved full ownership in my name, how all legal responsibilities fell back to me. Everything was done cleanly, quietly, within the law. No yelling, no police sirens, just paperwork, the kind of weapon people underestimate until it cuts. By noon, more people had gathered outside. My son stepped out, holding his head, his face tight with shame. His wife followed, glaring at the world like it was to blame. Reporters weren't there, but gossip spreads faster than cameras. The street was alive with whispers again. This time, not against me. This time, my name wasn't the joke. It was the story. I turned away from the window and sat back down. My tea had gone cold, but it tasted better than ever. I didn't feel like celebrating. I didn't feel revenge. What I felt was something deeper. Balance. The world had corrected itself. I sat there for hours, listening to the distant noise fade. By evening, the house was quiet again. Curtains closed, cars gone, lights off. The laughter that once mocked me was replaced by silence, and silence to me was the sweetest sound of all. That evening, I walked past the house I once called home. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The air smelled of dust and endings. I moved slowly, leaning on my cane, not to show weakness, but to feel each step, to remember how the ground beneath my feet once belonged to me and had now, once again, returned to my name. The street that had watched me leave in shame now watched in silence. No one spoke. Faces peeked through half-open doors, curious, nervous, pretending not to look. The same people who had whispered before now bowed their heads slightly, not out of kindness, but out of respect. Justice makes people quiet. I stopped by the front gate. It was half open. My son stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red. He didn't look at me right away. He just stared at the ground, holding a small box of belongings, shirts, papers, a few old things that probably meant nothing to anyone but him. Behind him, his wife was shouting, angry, panicked, trying to stuff things into a suitcase. The pride that once made her cruel was gone. Her hair was messy, her voice cracked, her steps clumsy. Every inch of control she once had slipped away. I said nothing. I didn't walk closer. I just stood there and looked at what they had become. The walls were bare now, the furniture pushed aside, the sound of drawers slamming and boxes falling filled the air. They were packing their lives in silence and fear, the same fear they once made me feel. My son finally turned and looked at me. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came out. His eyes told the story. shame, guilt, confusion. I saw in him the boy he used to be, lost behind the man he had become. He opened his mouth again, maybe to say sorry, maybe to beg, but I lifted my hand slightly, not to hit, not to stop, but to tell him I didn't need to hear it. Some words mean nothing after the damage is done. He looked down again. The papers he once ignored now ruled his world. The house, the car, the business, all gone in one stroke of ink. Behind him, his wife's voice grew desperate. She argued with the officers still standing near the porch, demanding, crying, blaming. But the men didn't react. The law doesn't care for tears once truth has been signed. I turned away slowly and began walking down the road. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of thunder. It felt right. Storms always come after long silences. I reached the corner of the street and looked back one last time. They were standing together in the doorway, no longer king and queen of that house, just two broken people clinging to boxes. I didn't smile, but my chest felt light. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge. It was peace, the kind that comes when the world finally mirrors the truth. Word spread fast again, but this time it carried my name with a different tone. The old man they mocked had taken everything back. The whispers turned to respect, the pity to quiet admiration. Even the shopkeeper who once looked away now greeted me with both hands. "You showed them, sir," he said softly. I nodded but didn't answer. I didn't need praise. I only needed silence. In the following days, they moved out completely. Their friends disappeared. Their calls went unanswered. Even the people who once dined with them stopped returning messages. No one wants to stand beside a fallen king. I didn't check where they went. Maybe to a rented room. Maybe to her parents' house. It didn't matter. I wasn't curious. I had spent my whole life caring, and now I owed them nothing. I came back to my house, and stood in the doorway. The air inside was still, empty, but not lonely. The smell of paint and wood, the same scent from years ago, still lived in those walls. I walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of furniture, the corners I had built with my hands. I wasn't reclaiming space, I was reclaiming dignity. I sat in my old chair, near the same window where I once waited for respect that never came. This time, I didn't wait. I just breathed. The ruin was complete, not loud, not violent, but exact. They had taken everything from me once, and now they had lost everything because of me. The house was mine again, but I didn't fill it with noise. I filled it with silence, the kind that holds peace instead of pain. Every corner of that home whispered memories, both sweet and bitter. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, feeling the old wood that once carried laughter and later betrayal. The floor creaked beneath my feet like it remembered my steps. I opened the windows and let sunlight pour in. The dust danced in the light, like the ghosts of all the years I had spent building, working, giving. I didn't cry. There were no tears left to give. I made tea in the same kettle they once ignored me for using. I sat in the same chair they once refused to let me rest in. The world outside went on as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. I could finally breathe without bitterness. For the first time in years, my home felt like home again. Quiet, humble, clean. There were no voices calling me names, no footsteps echoing above me, no mocking laughter in the hallway. Only stillness. I looked out the window and watched the street. The same neighbors who once whispered behind my back now walked slower when they passed. Some nodded, some smiled faintly, but I didn't hold grudges. Their words no longer mattered. The truth had already done its work. I learned something through all of it. That revenge doesn't always need rage. Sometimes it only needs time, patience, and silence. The kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. I remembered the night they threw me out, the sound of the door slamming, the cold wind on my face, the feeling of being nothing. And then I looked around at what that moment had created, a man reborn from his own humiliation. I wasn't the weak father they mocked. I was the man who had built everything and quietly taken it all back. I had carried them, fed them, protected them. They answered with cruelty. I answered with calm. My son came back 1 week later. I heard his knock on the door while I was watering the small plant near the porch. He didn't knock hard. It was soft, the kind of knock that comes from someone who no longer stands tall. When I opened the door, he looked smaller, thinner, older. His eyes were red, his shoulders dropped. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked around. At the garden I had rebuilt, at the walls he once claimed, at the home that no longer belonged to him. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but his voice broke. He finally whispered, "I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long time. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I didn't call him names. I just said, "You taught the street to laugh at me. Now live with their eyes on you." He lowered his head and nodded, tears running down his face. I turned away and went back to my chair. He stood there for a few moments, maybe waiting for forgiveness that wasn't his to take. Then he left quietly. I didn't watch him go. I just stared at the window, at the light shifting through the trees. My tea steamed beside me, and I took a slow sip. The warmth filled my chest. The silence felt right. I didn't need anything else. Not their apology, not their presence, not their pain. The lesson was already written in the life they now had to live, empty, cold, and without the roof they mocked me under. That was enough. I've seen storms, I've seen hunger, I've seen betrayal. But nothing hurts more than being unloved by your own blood. Yet nothing heals more than reclaiming your dignity. People think strength is loud, but they're wrong. True strength is silent. It's in the way you stand back up when the world thinks you're finished. It's in the way you smile when your enemies realize what you've done without ever raising your voice. I poured myself another cup of tea and looked outside. The world looked calm. The air was cool. I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in peace. They kicked me like dirt. I picked up one phone and let the dirt bury them instead. Then I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let silence do what words never could.